ready to go. So a bit tricky because we're in Zoom, rather than a collective group where we can, kind of get people to stand up and mix with each other. But anyway, that's okay. It's sign of the time. So now we get into a bit of the guts of it. And I guess what's important here is that, these are some ideas and there is no silver bullet, I guess you would say, do X, Y, and Z and you'll be good to go. Everything is different, as we've said all along. And it's not really showing you a bare minimum of what needs to be done. This is more about, here's some examples of what others have done. And you can kind of form your own opinions on whether you think that they're great or they need work, but they're really really there to provoke some thought and a bit of discussion, hopefully. And what we'll do is we'll talk about the drafting approaches according to sections in a planning scheme and how it might usually fit. So some things that I want to preface it with as well is that really this is a horses for courses approach. So what are the Indigenous interests that you're looking to protect? And it's going to be different depending on where you are. And I think the other thing that's really important is that, you don't throw the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. The usual principles of good planning scheme drafting still apply. So, having that clear and consistent line of sight in policy from the strategic framework right down through codes and even policy if need be, planning scheme policy. You also need to be making sure that you've got that consistency in what that policy says, that say it once, say it the same, deliver it in further detail as you step down. So making sure that it's all too easy to kind of say, we'll put this in one zone and then it'll deal with it. But in actual fact, the outcomes that might come through from engagement cover multiple zones and multiple overlays and codes. So making sure that complex web all fits together and is effectively singing from the same hymn book. Geez, I'm talking in a lot of kind of sayings here, aren't I, Cassie? Also, don't, as we've said all along, don't duplicate other legislation where it's not necessary. If it already does the role, refer to it and let it do its job. It's also important to be clear and simple. Try not to make things overcomplicated. It's just say it clearly, say it once, say it well. And don't try to regulate things that aren't necessary. But again, you're working within the same system, the current system. There's no new system for Indigenous and different rules, So valuing, protecting and promoting. Fairly high level statements, all really important. And I think what they mean in an individual sense is really dictated by what your outcomes of engagement are saying. What are your stakeholders saying are the important things that they want to promote or value? It could be a combination of things as simple as an acknowledgement of traditional owners in the upfront strategic vision, or kind of some acknowledgement early on to say that these are the groups and these are the traditional owners in which this planning scheme applies to. Might be as also as simple as using some traditional language for particular features in the area. It might be you have its common term, then in brackets you might use the Indigenous term for argument's sake. There might be an acknowledgement of important cultural landmarks and landscapes, whether that be through mapping or through words in the strategic framework, in a code, in a zone code, something like that. There might also be an opportunity to identify a planning scheme policy, for argument's sake, that has a trigger for third-party advice or a consultation process where it's particularly important. But again, that needs to be thought through carefully because there's other unintended consequences that may come with that, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. And probably one of the big ones is that light touch throughout the scheme, where it recognises Indigenous activities and aspirations in multiple zones and codes and things like that. And that seems to be, from the schemes that I've looked at, the ones that have done it well, seems to be a really common feature. So what does this mean in terms of planning scheme architecture? So we'll talk a little bit about how it could be applied in strategic framework and look at some examples too, which hopefully I've chosen ones that are known of up your way. So the strategic framework could include elements like acknowledgement of country and strategic vision, as I said before, traditional owner references to features, whether it be in the wording or in the mapping itself. As I said earlier, the feedback and the categories of feedback that you may get from consultation could cover things like economic outcomes in terms of eco infrastructure or home-based business, or kind of introducing new business opportunities that specifically relate to Indigenous people. So looking to facilitate that in locations that are appropriate. Acknowledgement of cultural sites, protection of country in terms of, a big one was visual amenity. So those landscapes, that might be one, or just flat out protection of particular locations, which by protecting biodiversity or the environmental outcomes that are there, you're also de facto protecting the cultural heritage sites that sit within that.
So I don't know if you can see Julie's question, Josh, but she's just asked if you would be able to also let everyone know of what planning schemes you think have done it well.
Yes, they're coming up. So they're spread throughout, and we'll have a conversation. I don't want to say who's done it well and who hasn't, because that may not be particularly appealing to people, but we'll have a discussion about them and you can kind of form your own views. I will say that the one that Brett did was very good. I like that one, Brett. So there you go. Which was, he'll tell me in a minute and I've got it in here. But so there might be also opportunities to identify in the housing outcomes of living on country and housing aspirations in general. Also looking at how you resolve those competing interests. So in terms of protection of cultural importance as opposed to other development aspirations that may be promoted through zones. And also it might be as simple as strategic framework mapping, that there's a map that shows registered native title determinations or traditional owner lands, or it could be the obvious being cultural sites and landscapes. So here you are, Julie.
Thank
Here's
you.
one. That's all right. And look, some of the state guys may have worked on this, but I actually found that this is a pretty good one in terms of that light touch and filtering Indigenous outcomes throughout the scheme. So you can see, for example, there in the strategic framework and the economic wellbeing, they actually talk about tourism infrastructure, including Aboriginal cultural tours. And there's also a provision that talks about capitalising on the natural and cultural assets and having small-scale cultural tourism in good living areas. So they have, Eastern Kuku-Yalanji has good living areas, and I guess it was almost like a master plan that's been turned into a local plan that identifies the aspirations on traditional owned land. So being clear in that the outcome sought in that area is a small scale cultural tourism, not just saying we want tourism in these areas or whatever, and directing you to where it should be, I think is particularly useful. Does anyone have any observations on those provisions? If it's been done well, if they think there's room for improvement on that. But I think the key point that I wanted to flag there was that there's an ability to feed it through your existing structure of a scheme, rather than having to create whole new sections or whole new provisions, So let's see. This is in the same. No, this might be in a different scheme. there's provisions in here in the land use pattern that talk about traditional owners living on country is provided for. Development respects the lifestyle and amenity of these communities and where possible improves resilience and self-sufficiency. So again, that's kind of been born out of some of those aspirations that we spoke about earlier in terms of, moving back onto country and, the self-sufficiency kind of outcomes that they want. By the way, it is still Cook Shire because it's got Eastern Kuku-Yalanji there. So, but I know that area actually covers 2 local government areas. So, and both local governments have Eastern Kuku-Yalanji provisions in them. I can't remember what the other one is. Brett, you might remember.
It's Douglas Shire, and I actually thought that first bit was out of Douglas Shire, but I'm not sure.
When I had a look at it, it looked like, there were a lot of provisions that seemed to be almost like duplicates. They're very similar.
There was the common planning process that was done across both local government areas there.
No, that's right. And I think the consultant that did that was did a really great job. I know who that is, and they were excellent. So I think the other thing that that they've picked up there in that land use pattern is that traditional owners will construct dwellings and associated buildings in line with the precinct intent, and those intents are very clearly spelt out in the local plans. And it also, what it does quite well as well is link in reference to an LUI and consideration of that LUI and some of the outcomes that were also achieved through Wet Tropics Management Authority and their native title determination. Some of these things get kind of filtered out later on. So you can see there again how it's starting to really tell that story in a number of subtle places. Okay, zoning. I think it's really important to consider from the outset how you balance the Indigenous interests in the area, what the ILUAs are saying, if there are any ILUAs, whether they're relevant, any cultural considerations and beliefs, and potential you could use like an approach of precincts. But there's some examples that I've kind of come up with here and seen in other locations. There might be like a living on country precinct within a rural zone, or there might be an Indigenous enterprise precinct within a conservation zone to facilitate things like ecotourism. But again, sometimes these approaches are actually more complicated than they need to be. Instead of adding additional layers on, you can work within the parameters of what's already provided for. And I think that also comes back to the point that we raised right back at the start, where someone said, is there going to be a new zone developed? And I guess the response to that is, do you really need a new zone, or can you work within the existing zones that are there and adapt overall outcomes to fit within that? So a conservation zone, for example, is something where where GMY can work with and identify outcomes that aren't inconsistent with the overall intent, but actually achieve what they want to. That's been identified through consultation. So that, I'm not saying that there's a specific answer there, but it's more thought-provoking to say, well, you can kind of work within the existing parameters of what's there. Does anyone have any particular views on that? No. Trying to find someone that I can single out. Catherine, I'm going to single you out, sorry. I know that you are going through some of that processes and stuff that I've seen from Townsville's been particularly good late. So, do you guys have any thinking around how some of these things might be approached?
For Townsville, not yet. It's been very much the early days, so they've only just sort of commenced. So nothing off the top of my head. We've been doing some with Palm, but nothing's changed from the alignment amendment scheme that they do have. And the other 2 new ones that I've got in the go is Richmond and Vertigan. And it was really hard just to get them to put a statement in the strategic framework.
Yeah.
Mainly because they knew who the parties were and they've tried to consult, but it's a really hard process.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Okay. Well, I singled you out because I thought you might have had some suggestions there. But
No, not yet. Maybe this time next year, like I'll have some.
So, look, just in terms of discussing assessment benchmarks that might fall within those zones is, that there might be an ability there to facilitate preferred forms of Indigenous housing. So, it might be that it's being flagged as an overcrowding issue, but it's actually an inappropriate type of housing. So, the 3-bedroom slab on ground isn't actually appropriate for a multi-generational family to live in. So, it might be things like that. There might also be tests in assessment benchmarks that talk about Indigenous development that can occur where certain community benefit or cultural benefit tests can be met. You might also want to talk about scenic and cultural values and how they could be protected at a zone level, although sometimes it kind of goes across a number of zones. So it might be in an overlay or something like that that's already existing. Do you need to look at protection of cultural heritage? There's a lot of zones that might have a single provision in there that just highlights again the responsibilities of protection of those areas and then links it back to Cultural Heritage Act. You might also look at, instead of encouraging, there might also be provisions that you think about where there's uses that are inconsistent with the traditional and cultural values of the land. So, you might be explicit in saying these types of uses or this form of development isn't supported in these locations because of these reasons. So, that might be an approach as well. And again, it comes down to the overall approach that's being taken in the scheme. So here's some examples of what others have done, and that's a bit of a grab bag from a whole heap of areas. And now what I want to ask you guys is, are there any in there in particular that you think are unhelpful? I'll give you another minute. Okay, anyone want to flag anything that they think probably needs a little bit of work? So Julie, this goes back to your question about, is there anything you don't like? Anyone at all?
I think
You single someone out.
Hard to measure, Catherine.
Yeah, yep.
D is hard to measure, like it, and maybe it's just
spot on.
Terms that we don't use all the time and they're not defined terms in the planning legislation.
Yeah, spot on. That's what I reckon as well. So activities undertaken by recognised traditional owners with particular activities that aren't just land management practices. But what's traditional owner custom and practice? What does that mean? Like how can that be fleshed out? That was in a code, by the way, not in strategic framework. So it does make it difficult to do. Anyone see anything in there that they think is particularly good?
No, I was going to point out that seasonal is pretty, again, it's like D, what is seasonal? And then have they mapped the specific parts of that particular zone?
Yeah.
So that's not particularly written well.
Yeah, I think that's also right. Some things that they have done okay there, but is talking about the scale of development and it being limited to campsites. So there's kind of parts in there that are okay and parts that aren't. Yeah. Okay, so we might move on. I think there was a comment, but I can't bring it back up. It's disappeared from my screen. Can you get it?
It was Julie. And Julie just said that you could use the term Aboriginal tradition, for which there is an Acts Interpretation Act definition.
Oh, great. That's good to know. There you go. You learn something new every day. Okay, so some of the other observed approaches through schemes throughout the state were that the protection of multiple values were achieved through conservation, rural, and environmental zones. So again, by having those zones there, you're also reducing or limiting the extent of development that can happen. And by default, that might be protecting visual amenity cues, might be protecting cultural heritage sites, that type of thing. So, there's very intentional reasons why those zones may have been used. There was also an observed approach of quite generic heritage requirements, cultural heritage requirements, and again, that could probably be explained by the fact that another act deals with it quite well. Zoning, there were a few where it actually had zoning that was reflective of what the PBC wanted to do in that area. So, particular or smaller areas have been zoned for different purposes than, say, the surrounding rural zone. Or in some instances, I think there were precincts where it allowed other forms of development to occur within that particular zone. And there was also exceptions for Indigenous development. So this type of development cannot occur except where for this, and this, which was quite useful, I thought. Here's the question we've already spoken about, why not a new zone? Again, probably the underlying message there is that you can work with what's already provided, and you can adjust overall outcomes and draft overall outcomes in a way that will still meet that. So, is there a point to overcomplicating scheme architecture? Is there a way that you can deal with it through overlays? And if all else fails, maybe something like a local plan of precincts, which others have done. Assessment tables, our favourite theme. So again, consider from the outset general exemption. So what could be accepted development? Should it be a starting point of what could be accepted or accepted subject to requirements? And then things that can't be resolved, move up the ladder. Consider whether a temporary use can be addressed by another approach. So for example, some places have local laws that deal with certain temporary uses, and is it actually defined as development? Can it be dealt with through some other mechanism? Again, is it even defined as development? Some of the traditional practices won't be. So look, here's some examples of things that may be able to be drafted. So, nature-based tourism, where for walking and cultural tours, not involving building work or vegetation clearing of remnant vegetation, and using existing features and infrastructure such as campgrounds, cleared areas and walking trails, that might be an example where it's really being scoped down quite tightly to say, well, this can be accepted, or this is accepted subject to requirements. And, something might be a little bit more complicated. And again, trying to scope it down really tightly is where for an MCU or building work made accessible under the planning scheme for the purpose of an outstation, dwelling house or emergency shelter, where on native title determined lands and undertaken by or on behalf of RNTBC and not located with an overlay for bushfire hazards, for any of those hazards, may be exempt, so accepted. So some of them are complicated in that they're really trying to clamp them down, but it just kind of illustrates that there are ways that you can really be very clear on that type of use that you don't really need to regulate. Here's some examples of what others have done. So a rural zone here, educational establishment for Aboriginal and cultural training is code accessible, where it would otherwise be something else, probably impact. And in the conservation zone, outstation is accepted development. And I'm sure, as Brett said earlier, and a number of the other DSDM, Treasury guys, sorry guys, that there's been a really strong take up of that outstation term. And from everything that I saw, accepted development for outstation was a reasonably common approach. Overlays. So again, consider from the outset, do you need to regulate cultural heritage if there's other acts that already do it? Also, if you're going down the path of trying to identify culturally important sites and things, is there sufficient information for an overlay? Is there enough understanding there to be able to allow you to effectively regulate development around it? Does it need to be an overlay, or is that another layer of complexity? is there just particular locations where an overlay might occur? So for argument's sake, if you did want to do an overlay that had Indigenous interests, might it just be focused on a particular area where urban expansion's occurring? And I think, Brett, one of the schemes that you did, was it Croydon or the other one, while it wasn't an overlay, it had particular requirements for development where an expansion area was adjoining the town?
Yeah, certainly in Croydon, the Tagalaka people wanted some mapping included in the scheme of some of the areas around town that they thought could be at risk, just due to their proximity to the urban area.
Yeah. Yeah, and again, that to me seemed to be a sensible approach, because you weren't applying it holus bolus to the entire rural zone. It was a very focused and intentional area where there is some threat of something occurring potentially. Whereas if you kind of applied it across the entire zone, you might be unnecessarily capturing development that doesn't need to be captured.
That's right. Yeah, so that was pretty targeted.
Yeah, and I think that was a good example of where that could be used quite effectively. But again, acknowledging that that's not in that wasn't in an overlay, but it was in something similar. So what might an overlay code cover? We've already covered off on that. Cultural places, landscape, so it might be visual. It might form part of a visual amenity overlay, for example, and other values that you might be identifying in consultation. So again, there's no restriction on what overlays can cover, but think about it in the context of overall complexity of the scheme and ability to kind of get caught up in knots a little bit if you're adding additional layers and the unintended consequences that come with that. And again, in terms of the code, you might want to trigger things like a cultural and visual assessment in particular locations where it might impact on particular values. There might be a requirement to demonstrate how you avoid or manage impacts on Aboriginal interests. You need to be very clear on what they are. Sticking to core requirements and thinking about other processes for protection. So it may not necessarily be through the code, or the code might refer to a planning scheme policy that outlines a way that you can do an assessment that might be relevant and enough for a planning scheme, for a DA, and through the assessment process. It might also be a trigger for third-party advice processes through a planning scheme policy, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but you also need to be aware with that there would be a whole heap of other processes that would need to come into place. So who's it being referred to? What are the timeframes that they have to turn it around? Is there any resourcing implications for those people? So there's a whole heap of complexities that come with something like that approach. And we've already spoken about CMPs and CMAs and the fact that they can add quite a bit of time to the process, and are they actually relevant in the assessment of the DA, or is it something that can be conditioned to happen later? So here's an example of what others have done. So I actually think the first one on the left might have been from Townsville. So they've, in the Cultural Heritage Overlay Code, which primarily covers heritage places, European heritage places, there's a statement there that says places of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island cultural heritage significance are conserved and managed in a culturally appropriate way. And that terminology there has been picked up from Cultural Heritage Act. And there's a provision down later, and I think that might be, the one beside it that says there's no acceptable outcome. There's an editor's note that refers you to the duty of care provisions and the provisions under the Act. Here's the Cowan Yarm example. Again, identifying locations within the town where culturally important places are, not outside of the town. And then the assessment table for that talks about self-assessment where you're not located next to one of those provisions, and where you are, it then kind of tips into the zone code where it lists what the feature in the place is, where it is, and why it's important. And then there's particular provisions in there that talk about what you can and can't do in those areas. Codes and assessment benchmarks. important to consider from the outset, is a standalone code necessary? And again, the flavour of what we've been talking about is probably not. You can probably work it within codes that are already in the framework and the architecture of the scheme. And it's also relevant to flag there, and I'll put it in bold, is that a lot of the outcomes and the protection and the processes and provisions that you're trying to relay in the scheme aren't new. So they may not exclusively apply for Indigenous interests. They may just be, something about protection of MSES or MNES or something like that, which is a blanket thing. It's not something that's unique. But by doing that, you're still protecting the interests of the Indigenous people. Look at that. There it is, Brett, in all its glory. So this is another approach that Brett developed in one of the template schemes. We spoke about that already in terms of, in the general development code, areas that have been mapped where you actually need to consider Aboriginal cultural heritage in the areas that are most likely to be developed. Hopefully that summary's done it enough justice, Brett. Planning scheme policies. Again, consider from the outset, the duty of care outcomes are already provided in the Aboriginal Cultural Heritage Act and the Torres Strait Island Cultural Heritage Act. So is there a need to identify it in PSP and it be triggered through a code? Is a purpose of the planning scheme policy only to raise awareness of external resources? And do you need to actually put that in a planning scheme policy? And what would be the purpose of that? Is it to just raise, as I said, raise awareness for the user? Hey, by the way, you need to be aware that this is really important. And that goes to Cassie's comment earlier about, hey, this act's been in place for 17 years. Why don't you know about it? So there could be value there in educating. And is a PSP map for information purposes more relevant, or should it belong in a strategic framework map or another map, an overlay map? And can there be processes developed there for third-party advice? So the content might talk about a comprehensive approach to identifying Indigenous interests. So it might be like a quasi kind of CMA process, but not quite the same. Does it have mapping and lists of sites? So the Kawanyama one did that, for example. Is there an explanation of the values of the sites or the landscape? So, one of the questions that was raised right back at the start is, do we need to do a cultural heritage register? And the answer was no, but it may be something that logically would fit in there. And it might also be the location rather than a strategic framework map, where you might put the location of native title terminations or things that are pending, so that people are aware of who they might need to consult with. Now there's an example of that which is in one of your handouts, which I won't go through, and I actually think it may have been from the Croydon scheme as well. So there are other approaches as well, and again, these are in your handouts, which really talk about the ability to do a local plan. And I think the one from either Cook or Douglas is in there, the Eastern Kuku-Yalanji, about the type of content that you might put in a local plan, what's important there, how others have gone about it. In terms of, with the Eastern Kuku-Yalanji, it's quite clear that they did a lot of consultation and they really zeroed in on the areas that they wanted for good living areas. And they've got a whole heap of definitions because they use a lot of local language. So they use local language for house, for all sorts of things. They also talk about the form and the type of development that might occur in those locations, what doesn't occur in those locations, the economic opportunities that might happen there. It's really useful stuff. I'd recommend having a look at that. And again, that flows on to another approach might be like what we're doing with GMY, which is a country-based plan, which will lead to amendments in the planning scheme. Obviously, there's a bit more complexity to that in that there's more players involved and council needs to be on board, or if you are council, the traditional owners need to be keen to take that process forward, which again links back to a point that we made right back at the start of making sure that you're not trying to impose a process, that it's something that group is coming up with or they want to do. And there's also opportunities in background studies, particularly for things like integrating science and tradition. So, it might be that in a bushfire study, there's a section in there on traditional management, and that comes up with some policy outcomes that then help to inform the planning scheme. So look, there's a range of those things that you guys can have a look through in those handouts. And by all means, come back to us with questions, whatever it might be. We're happy to answer those. So with that being said, what we'd probably like now is to just have an all-in discussion rather than going into groups, and share your experiences around developing policy for Indigenous people. If you don't have experiences there, maybe it's worth talking about what the plans might be to progress that, or what some of the potential blockages are and how you might look at moving through those. We can also have a chat about what worked well and what didn't in those people that have done that process, and just share the experiences so that those that are entering into those new processes have a bit of an idea, and what some of your biggest challenges were. So is there anyone that wants to start us off on that? Let's go, trying to pick, Andrew. Are you guys moving towards developing new scheme or new policy, and or have you been through a process where any of this has been utilised?
Funny you mentioned that. This would have been really handy in March if COVID didn't happen, because we have just given the state our major amendment, which seeks to bring us more in line with the advancing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander interests in the planning scheme. And I think the summary that you just gave through the various parts of the scheme was much more helpful than this document. It just explained it a lot better. It gave better examples, more practical examples at this stage. I'm sure when we get works through the state interest review, we'll maybe have some further changes to the scheme, but we've added more statements to our strategic framework. And just hearing some of the different or the other examples in the various parts of the scheme, we could possibly do more. For example, in the tables of assessment in relation to outstation, we've got a landscape character code, which we could add, cultural landscapes or statements around that too, that overlay code. So there's a range of things that we could possibly do to, again, continue the theme that's established in the strategic framework through the line of sight back through down into the scheme. Yeah, so would have been really handy in March.
Yeah. Well, it was COVID, because this was meant to happen in March, I think. But anyway, that's in terms of what you guys have done. Was there anything that you felt really worked particularly well in the drafting, the amendments that you've done?
Well, the amendments that we did put forward, they weren't extensive, but it was again was around some of the language as well. So even picking up some of the stuff from today, it may have worded the language in the statement slightly different. Like picking up things like the reference to, well, now that we have a determination, so using things like anti-determined lands or Aboriginal tradition rather than cultural practices or terms like that. I think it's a timing thing with us, but hopefully we can make some improvements in the months to come.
Yeah,
I hope that answered your question.
Yeah. Well, it certainly seems like what's been done is good, but like in the sense that seems like you've done quite a lot of work in that space, and it's really important to council to be valuing and acknowledging those those traditional owner outcomes, and really timely now, given that that the determination's been made, and I think that I'm sure you know that they'll be looking soon towards, well, what do we do now? You know, what do we
Yeah.
do with land? And so that would then feed into an engagement process of saying to them, hey guys, we're doing these amendments, or, you know, we're going to do a new scheme or whatever coming up. We know you've got your determination. What are your aspirations? What are your next steps? Is it, how might we, you know, because you also don't want to split the horses, and you know, a lot of Indigenous groups will not want to get too involved because they don't want to hem themselves in. You know, so it might be about, well, how do we word things broadly, or how do we do things that will enable you to achieve what you want on land that may not ordinarily be associated with development, but this is a different form of.
Yeah, and what we've now established in the strategic framework is a really good introduction into that as well. Because from what we had a one sentence, you know, sites of state and local significance provide a reflection on the Indigenous cultural heritage, and you know that was the extent of it. And so the how you described the strategic framework on your strategic framework slide, it's basically what we've incorporated into our scheme, or we want to, and we have proposed to incorporate into our scheme. And it is a good introduction for further discussions with the local Yurabara people to say, okay, well, now there's more in our scheme. Let's talk about how that then filters down into the different sections of the planning scheme.
Yeah, absolutely. That's great. Does anyone else have any experiences, Jackie or Sean?
So, as I mentioned in the sort of break-off sessions, I'm pretty new to plan making as a whole. Came from DA, and I'm from the Southern Downs, so we don't really have much involvement in Aboriginal cultural heritage or native title for that matter. So I guess really from my point of view, it's just about trying to establish a good foundation going forward. And from a DA perspective, how can we make any codes that we put in or intent that we put in measurable and meaningful as well? Because when you go through from a DA perspective, you know, if it's sort of not necessarily strengthened through your strategic intent and then into your codes, the DA planner may just glance over it. And so whilst from a plan making perspective, there's great intent there, it may not necessarily get sort of moved into the actual assessment. And you may have a controversial site where that potentially blows up, and then after the scorning, everyone, you know, sort of takes more attention. But until that point, you potentially lose the objectives there. So I guess for me, it would be about constant reinforcement in positive, meaningful ways. And how can you achieve multiple outcomes that really sort of help the parties? And I guess that comes through in your initial consultation, and making sure that we are sort of working towards a common goal, so that you don't lose that when you're eventually assessing those applications.
Yeah, I think that's right. And it's always the classic tension between strategic planning and DA and the implementation. And some of that also comes down to the clarity and the specificity of those provisions. And sometimes, you know, if they're not tight enough, it becomes a little unclear and all too hard. And so that's like, you know, I don't know what that means. Yeah, it'll be okay. You know, sometimes that can happen. I'm not saying it happens often, but you know, that it really underscores the value of being clear and concise in what you want. Jackie, have you got anything that you raised?
I'm sorry, I do have some connection issues. I'm not too sure whether you can hear that as well. But I'm very similar to Sean, very new to the plan making side of things. Very much been a DA-based planner for my career so far. So it's been quite a good learning experience actually today to get some of this background to kind of get moving in that space. So, and I know that it's obviously a very meaningful part of planning to be making sure that we're involving all the parties that need to be involved from the get-go. So it's just been really, really great to hear all of these different experiences and the best way to go about it. So
right, well, that's good. Any of the other guys, Julie, Joe, anyone else want to add anything? Otherwise, what we'll do is we'll move to the last part of the session, and the last part of the day. Hooray!
There's probably one thing, Josh, that I would add, and this really relates to what Helen was talking about this morning, in the amount of effort and time they've spent, and that you've spent trying to get the background planning to what they're doing correct. And the provisions that were in that Cookshire scheme, some of the provisions that you highlighted as being good provisions, the reason that they're good provisions is that they've come from what was a massive planning process, not town planning, but country planning process, which was, it spoke to so many people. They walked the country, they worked out what was where, they worked out whose aspirations were where. They've mapped all of the country to work out, which are the good living areas for that country. So the foundation in what is, a small couple of provisions in the planning scheme really come from a massive background study. And without those massive background studies, you're always going to have a bit of a superficial response in plan. So they cost a lot of money, though, and they take a lot of time. So I know that's not always available, and I'd love to direct people to where that money and time can come from. But, that's the foundation of good outcomes.
Yeah, absolutely. And Helen's the money bloodhound in terms of funding. She always knows where to get the cash from. But I think you make a really good point there. And something maybe that we saw from some of the previous examples was what Yarrabah did in terms of setting up an ability for those traditional owners to undertake their own process and then allow them to take the time, run it the way that they want to, and arrive at the outcomes. And then there being a willingness from council to look at how they integrate those outcomes into the scheme. So, it may, at the end of the day, for some areas, it may be as simple as saying we have these traditional owners here, they have native title, they have aspirations, but at this point in time, they're not quite ready to do those. But we put a process or facilitate a process in there for that to occur at the time that they're ready, and then have other provisions in there, and do some consultation definitely to understand the high level aspirations or the early aspirations. But I think you're right, and that's another risk, is that sometimes it may be premature because it's coming from a process from the local government or whoever, and the traditional owners and the native title bodies may not quite be there yet, may not be ready. So,
Josh, can I ask you a question before we move on to the next one?
Yes.
So the question I have is two small questions. One is, how do practicing planners use the information books, articles written by the academics on Indigenous planning? For example, I think last year there was a new book on planning for Indigenous Australia by 3 academics, Sue Jackson, Levi Porter, and Louis Johnson. So just trying to see how could we bridge between what the planners are doing versus what the academics are writing. That's the first one. The second one is this whole idea about, we have had very good, I think very informative. I really appreciate you, covering all these different elements of planning with Indigenous communities. But much of our focus is on Planning Act 2016. But in many of the remote areas, it may also be like priority development areas and state development areas. In that kind of case where it's under different legislation, like Economic Development Act 2012, how do you operate some of these things that you've discussed? I mean, community planning is still relevant, but how about the land use planning? How do we go about doing consultation? How do we do land use planning under those legislation?
Yeah. Well, I'll probably answer the last one first. And look, that was something that was faced 10, 12 years ago when all of the Aboriginal Shire councils had planning schemes prepared for them. So even though it was under a planning act, at that point in time, there was nothing in those areas. The way that it was driven was that there's a requirement in the local government planning in the Local Government Act to say that a local government area must have a planning scheme. So they were declared as local governments, and so the state through DATSIT funded all of those processes. So we're effectively starting from scratch in terms of a planning scheme. But what they had previous to that were I can't quite remember the term, Julie. I think you know, but it's almost like a land use infrastructure type plan that basically identified areas for subdivision where you go. So
community expansion plans.
That's it. Expansion plan, which was really, from my mind, and correct me if I'm wrong, Julie, but was just looking at how they got the housing into those locations. How they got the infrastructure in there. There was a bit of kind of...
it was the forward planning that allowed them. So they were anticipating what the demand was for infrastructure provision, basically, and they were run mostly through engineering companies.
Yeah, that's right. And I think where the massive opportunity came there, it was an ability to have the community think about what story they want to tell and where the community is going as a whole, not just from an infrastructure perspective. So, and that was delivered through the strategic framework. So it gave an opportunity to say, well, what do we want to record and how do we want to record it in a statutory sense to say what's important to this community and how it grows. So in that instance, the way that they were developed was a lot of consultation, a lot of looking through what documents and information was available, which wasn't much, and just having a go at something and developing something that was a planning scheme and that can be built on in the future. So I don't know whether that really kind of helps to answer that second question. But you know, there are other legislations, you're 100% right, where things don't overlap. Often a planning scheme will apply to an entire local government area, except for where you've got places that are operated through, I always call them the LDA, but they're, what are they called now? They've been that for 10 years or more.
EDQ.
EDQ, that's it. Something with 4 letters and not 3 letters. But, you know, they're excise, but they have their own planning schemes as well. So it's really about that engagement process and taking it back to the start and thinking about what is the future direction for that community and how's that important, and getting it down in a structure that can be, you know, legislated, I guess you might say. But in terms of the bridging the gap with the academics, I think that's an age-old question, isn't it, Bishna? Where it's kind of that creative tension between theory and practice. And I, for one, certainly wasn't aware of that book, but I will look into it now. And I think that there's an element of advocacy there in terms of raising that awareness and you know, there being academics and practicing planners that are willing to step across into those different spheres and saying, well, what work are you guys doing? Because I know that QT and others, I think Griffith, have done a lot of work around Indigenous communities. And there's JCU as well in particular. But there's, you know, kind of sharing that information and getting it to work between practice and theory, I think is something that's challenging. I know that there was a great thesis that was done by a JCU final year student last year, and he's now employed in a private consultancy, and he's using some of the outcomes that he's developed in their everyday practice, which is great. And that's through Yarrabah Council. He does a bit of work through those guys as well. So, you know, it's really about recognising those opportunities, I think. But again, I don't have the silver bullet to be able to answer it, Vishnu.
Yeah, but I think we're having good dialogue at least, you know, that's good that, you know, we're seeing the connection actually. Yeah, this has been very helpful.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Josh.
We're having the
Lots of this-
conversation, aren't we?
Yeah.
Like it's
Good start, isn't it?
yeah, absolutely.
Julie said, I think Josh Walker did one of these too. Yes, I did do my master's thesis on QPP and Indigenous planning, but the way that through is through what I'm doing now. So, very slow, very slow burn. And Julie also said you could use the term Aboriginal tradition, for which there is an accent interpretation. Oh, that was a while ago. Yeah. No, that was great. Someone raised that. So, look, we put you through all of those slides, and guess what? We've been cheeky, and we've actually done a summary of what the state's expecting. So if we started here, it would have been done in half an hour. But, we've enjoyed your company so much that we thought that we'd leave it till last. As I said, there is no silver bullet, and there is no X plus Y equals Z. So really, whoops, went too far. Really, it's about, firstly, there is an expectation that you'll identify who the native title owners are and their extent of lands. In terms of the background material that you provide with a planning scheme amendment, a major one or a new scheme, the engagement plan is really important, and the summary report that actually shows the approaches and techniques for engagement and how you engaged with Indigenous people and how you identified who were the Indigenous people that were consulted with and how you verified that they were the right people to consult with. What the outcomes from engagement were. And then in the technical background reporting, it's also about how that feedback from engagement was or wasn't used to inform policy and background studies. So how was it used? How's it been applied? How's it been thought through? Also an identification of what those key Indigenous interests are and what they mean, and then how they may or may not have been reflected. And then in terms of the planning scheme content, it identifies there might be Indigenous policy in terms of, for example, ILUA inputs, cultural heritage, economic outcomes, social outcomes. So again, it might be just a light touch through the scheme, and there were some examples that were shown there. It might be a more fulsome approach that might occur as well. But again, as we've been saying throughout, there's no silver bullet, and this is the minimum, this is the bare minimum you must do. But what's provided on this slide here really helps you to understand what will be looked for when an assessment of those planning schemes and planning scheme amendments are undertaken. And then the last slide, which we've probably already spoken about, is just some reflections on the day and if there's any key take-home messages. And I think for me, the number one thing is engagement. Engagement is key. Having those conversations, having them early, allowing for them, making sure you consult with the right people, because that then really helps to collect the information and trickle through for how your policy is developed. It's I'll modify a saying, but sultanas in, sultanas out. It's really, I won't tell you what the actual saying is, but hopefully some people, Julie, you're looking puzzled, so I'll send you an email. But that reliable information in means reliable information out. If it's not so good, you're not going to get the outcomes that you want. So it's really important to be able to engage effectively and meaningfully and have those conversations continue. And then the other kind of take home for me is there's no silver bullet for how you address this. But certainly from my perspective, the light touch and the integrating it throughout the scheme is a good way to go, in my view. Anyone else have any reflections or things that they want to talk about? Anything that they think they like and they might adopt, or anything that they think is completely wrong and they want to now tell me how wrong I am? Because I'm happy to hear that as well.
Can I just say, Josh, I think from our experience that it's really important to keep an open mind. While I understand from a planning perspective, there's regulations and legislation that says you have to do it this way and you have to fit in this box. Whereas we're approaching our process as a think outside the box and look at how we can achieve these aspirations and use different instruments. And if we need to change policy, we'll change policy. So it's looking like be creative and I think have an open mind. And the great thing too is about working in Aboriginal communities and Torres Strait Islander communities is that you'll have the opportunity to travel and meet the most amazing, wonderful people and see the most amazing countries. So I think like this is a really good thing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, but also for you and your careers and your personal development, professional development, is that you can actually walk away with a really rewarding outcome to know that you've done something really incredible to change the lives of many, not just a few.
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, I think certainly from my perspective, working with Indigenous people is extremely rewarding and extremely educational. Because they're just so astute and attuned to country and you know, they have some really great insights and good ways of looking at things that we may not look at in the same way.